The Highland Charge was the shock strategy that made the Scottish clans of the 17th and 18th century known as ferocious and unreserved fighters. But its very unfortunate use at the Battle of Culloden in 1764, which was recently quite successfully shown on the TV series Outlander, is what makes most people know about it. It is important to underline how somewhat popular representations alter the truth of this strategy. The Highland attack was not as failing as many films or the fight of Culloden itself would have implied. Actually, it proved to be a true test for the British government troops and gave the Highlanders multiple military successes. We question in this video what made this strategy so successful and how precisely it worked. On September 21st, 1745, an army of the British government encountered an army of Jacobite Scotsmen in a marshy location southeast of Edinburgh, who brilliantly destroyed the British forces in one of the most successful Highland charges ever. Supporters of the House of Stuart, the reigning house in England, but replaced upon James II of England's exile following the Glorious Revolution, the Jacobites were living in exile in France. The Stuarts sought to reclaim what they felt to be their kingdom. This in mind, Charles Edward Stuart, sometimes known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, set out a rebellion by visiting Scotland in 1745. Numerous supporters, mainly men from the Scottish Highlands, joined his forces and helped him seize Edinburgh, Scotland's capital, on 17 September 1745. Sir John Cope, the leader of the government forces in Scotland, reacted fast and marched to recover the city and halt Charles with an army of 2,300 soldiers and 6 guns. When the Jacobites arrived to meet him, he positioned his soldiers behind a swamp south of the village of Prestonpans, ready for action on the next morning. However, the Highlanders did not wait until daylight, but marched around the marshy area and approached Cope's troops from their eastern flank. Just in time, the commander recognized them and reorganized his forces to meet the onslaught. But his soldiers were not prepared for this and gave little opposition to the Highland Charge of the Jacobites. First, the artillery retreated, then the cavalry routed, and last, the infantry gave in. Suffering less than 5% fatalities, the Jacobites defeated the government troops, killed roughly 500, and captured at least as many. What made this rapid triumph possible was the psychological influence of the Highland Charge. Being on the receiving end of such an attack was horrifying. One of the few survivors of the Battle of Knocknanoose in November 1647 recalls that the Highlanders came routing down like a torrent tempestuously on our foot. Similarly, the government troops at Prestonpans met a swarm of obviously insane Highlanders who ran towards the muzzles of their muskets, uncaring of the consequences, furiously yelling Gaelic war cries. These examples indicate that the power of the Highland Charge resided less in the actual force of impact, but in the fear it generated in the enemy. Even experienced troops frightened at the sight of charging Highlanders, let alone rookie recruits. At Prestonpans and also at Killiecrankie in 1689, another fight commonly mentioned in this regard, holes emerged in the enemy's lines even before the Highlanders had actually made contact. The psychological effect was, in fact, so vital that there are very few instances of a Highland Charge actually meeting with an intact opposing infantry unit. Should the adversary stay solid, the Highlanders frequently stopped just before the battle, retreated, and charged again later. If they didn't stop, though, a ferocious melee would develop, in which the Highlanders could easily receive the short end of the deal, as was, for example, the case in the Battle of Culloden, about which we'll talk in a minute. First, let's take a quick look back. The origins of the Highland Charge are very much veiled in myth, but many historians estimate that the Highland clans and their Irish allies first utilized the technique in the 1640s. Some researchers, for example the military historian David Stevenson, ascribe its development to an Irish officer named Alistair MacCulloch, who allegedly developed this technique for the special demands of his forces during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms in 1639 to 1651. While this is not definite, it is certain that the Highlanders had generally relied on charges for a long time, with the Highland Charge as such being an adaptation of this custom. Before the advent of guns, Highlanders had relied on tight formations headed by heavily armed melee fighters with battle axes and claymores, their infamous two-handed swords. This tactic was no longer viable in the late 16th and 17th centuries, when arquebuses and muskets, and subsequently pike and shot warfare, spread on the British Isles. Therefore, the Highlanders changed their ways, substituting their heavy axes and two-handed swords for lighter weapons, such as basket-hilted broadswords, long knives, axes, and round shields, most famously the distinctive targus. In addition, they increasingly relied on firearms. These new weapons perfectly fit the needs of the new shock strategy they now began to adopt, the Highland Charge. Like other shock tactics, excellent morale was the vital aspect to a successful Highland Charge. The men had to trust each other and their commanders, and they had to be completely resolved to charge at the enemy, fully aware they would face at least one volley. Because of this, friends and family members frequently battled together and formed groups of approximately 12 men. Also, speed was of the essence, which is why the Highlanders frequently got rid of unneeded gear before battle and preferred dry, slightly falling ground. When they were ready to attack, the Highlanders proceeded towards the enemy, shot a salvo from around 40-50 millas, and then started charging. Covered by the gun smoke, shouting and clamoring, they surged forward, and as they ran, they formed up in larger clusters, most typically in one or more wedge formations, aiming at the weakest places in the enemy line. And if this terrible flood of warriors was not enough to persuade the other side that they had urgent appointments elsewhere. As the historian Charles Carleton puts it, the Highlanders threw themselves onto the enemy lines to break the formation. Just before making contact, they fell on one knee, plunged under the enemy weapons, parried the pike or bayonet of the man they were immediately facing with their shield, and then drove upward at the defenseless upper body of their opponent. If they succeeded in breaking the line, they proceeded to take the enemy down in close combat, relying on the advantage of their shorter weaponry. The Highlanders skillfully exploited the weak places they created by terror or force by pushing into the formation, rolling up the unprotected flanks of surrounding units, or getting all the way to the back of the formation to stop those leaving and cause even more mayhem. These charges by no means always proceeded as smoothly as at Prestonpans. In the aforementioned Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689, for example, an outnumbered Jacobite army overcame Scottish government troops by intercepting them on the pass of Killiecrankie and using the Highland Charge to break through their line, which was extended out widely to maximize firepower. The government troops fired 3 lethal volleys before the Highlanders reached them, and in the ensuing battle, the Jacobites suffered even more casualties, finally losing approximately a third of their army. One explanation for the huge losses the Highlanders experienced at Killiecrankie was that their opponents were equipped with a new weapon that enabled them to defend themselves considerably better against shock attacks, the plug bayonet. This bayonet functioned as a sort of half-pike that helped the musketeers to protect themselves when charged. Because of this, the pikemen who had previously done this work could be replaced with additional shot units. This dramatically boosted the infantry's firepower. However, the plug bayonet had a fundamental disadvantage. It was inserted into the musket barrel, and so prevented shooting when mounted. Consequently, a formation under attack could only fix the bayonets in the last minute. Because this required substantial time, the attacking troops had a high chance of reaching them before they were ready to defend themselves. The adoption of the plug bayonet was part of a fast upgrade of the British Army in the second half of the 17th century. Quickly, the bayonet became standard infantry equipment, the bulky early muskets were replaced with lighter flintlock muskets, and prefabricated paper cartridges were introduced, which made reloading much easier. Towards the end of the century, the plug bayonet was replaced by the socket bayonet, which was attached to the side of the barrel rather than plugged into the muzzle, making it feasible to shoot while it was mounted. These modifications presented a challenge to the Highlanders. To evade the volleys from the more efficient flintlock muskets, they often laid down on the ground after firing their volley and let the adversary return fire. This way they were less exposed, and the powder smoke got even denser, offering more protection. Nevertheless, the new British force made for a strong opposition, and the Highlanders' fatalities soared. This development reached a culmination in one of the most famous conflicts in which the Highland Charge was deployed, the Battle of Culloden, on 16 April 1746. This encounter revealed what may happen if a Highland Charge clashed with a formation that remained firm. After his triumph at Prestonpans, Charles Edward Stuart had moved into England. However, before he had achieved anything of value, his army began to dissolve because of internal disputes until he finally had to retreat. When he learnt that the commander-in-chief of the government forces, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, was approaching with an army of roughly 9,000 men, he arranged his remaining 5,000 troops at Culloden Moor to await the pursuing army. During the night before the fight, the Jacobites again tried a nighttime assault, but failed because they didn't reach Cumberland's camp in time. So, for better or worse, they had to stay in their somewhat unpleasant position. The next day, 16 April 1746, Cumberland's artillery launched the battle. This suffered tremendous losses, and the Bonnie Prince had no choice but to order a direct attack. Not wanting to supply the cannon with a target any longer than necessary, the Highlanders dashed over the 500 or so yards of swampy ground between the two forces and charged Cumberland's troops in 3 groups. When they closed in, the British turned to canister shot, shotgun rounds for artillery, which caused huge losses even before they reached the British line and slowed down the center. To avoid the swampy terrain in front of them, they turned to the right. Meanwhile, the troops on the left and right made touch with the British infantry, who had explicitly been commanded to withstand the charge and not leave their position. On the entire front line, Cumberland's soldiers thrust at the adversary to their right instead of the one straight ahead to escape the Highlanders' targets. This was fairly effective, and the Highlanders on the left eventually forced to retire when Cumberland's cavalry counterattacked. The group on the right flank, however, managed to break through the first line after a terrible struggle, but were pushed back by a regiment attacking from the second line before they could exploit their triumph. This was troublesome since the Jacobite center had joined them to exploit the weak position there, and now both were trapped in the crossfire of the government forces. In less than half an hour, nearly 50% of the troops who had participated in the Highland Charge had perished, and Cumberland's cavalry slaughtered hundreds more as they sought to flee the battlefield. Despite this disastrous defeat, the Highland Charge remained in use for several decades after Culloden. However, as firearms developed even further, it posed ever more risk. This became obvious in what was supposedly the last Highland Charge, which took place during the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in 1776 during the American Revolutionary War. In this battle, about 1,000 Highlanders in the service of the English monarch rushed an equal force who had entrenched themselves on a bridge. They were cruelly shot to pieces,